Hi, this is Mr. Gideon. So now we're going to begin Unit 2. And Unit 2 focuses on macroeconomic measurement. This is where we officially get into our main focal point for the semester, macroeconomics. Not to say that we'll never discuss microeconomics again, but most of our focus is going to be on the macro level. And when it comes to measurement, economists take measurements of the economy to figure out how the economy is doing. There are three basic areas of measurement that they focus on. These are not the only areas of measurement, though. One is prices. So we take a look at prices to judge whether they're rising and how quickly they're rising, and that would be inflation in that case, as well as deflation, where prices are declining. We also use inflation figures and price indexes to make conversions from one year to another to be able to compare apples to apples. The job market is another area of focus, specifically employment and unemployment calculations, as well as productivity. GDP and real GDP are ways for us to judge for any country how productive they are in terms of the goods and services they're producing for sale. So let's see how we're doing right now in the United States. Go ahead and click on this link. I've already opened it up. And what you want to do is scroll to the bottom of the page here to see the most pertinent figures. Inflation as of now, and at the time of this recording it's June 20th, 2011, so it's going to be a different set of figures most likely, definitely a different date for you whenever you click on this link. The inflation is 3.44%. GDP is at a growth rate of 1.84%, and unemployment is 9.1%. So that's where we are right now. Now let's delve in a little bit more specifically to prices and employment. We're going to deal with prices first in this tutorial. You see a picture of a note that comes from another country that is worth $100 trillion. I have actually one of these notes, one of these bills, it's worth, I believe, $100 trillion, or at least 100 trillion worth of the currency for that country, which has now been discontinued. The question is that worth a lot or not? It all depends on the price of the products and services that you would use that currency to purchase. Here are some key ideas from this chapter, though. We measure prices in order to determine whether we are achieving price level stability. The CPI is really the most common way that we try to judge this, so we're going to go through some calculations for the CPI. We also measure unemployment in terms of how many people can find jobs and participate in the labor force that want to, but there's some other calculations that we can take a look at to judge the labor market. Full employment exists when the economy is operating at its natural unemployment rate, and that although it might seem a little bit counterintuitive, the natural unemployment rate does not mean that ideally, naturally, we're going to have a job for every single person that wants one. Or even more specifically, that people are going to have jobs at all times if an economy is operating at its maximum potential with regards to the labor market. But let's get back to prices. So if we're measuring prices in macroeconomics, we're referring to aggregate prices. Now this happens as a result of measuring individual prices and tracking them over a period of time. There are workers, in fact, for the government that will go to the same location month after month and look for changes as small as 1 penny in the exact same products and services and report those to the central office, who then compiles national figures based on aggregate or all prices. Although you can't, from a practical sense, track every single price of every single thing that's out there for sale. You just don't have the man or woman power to do that. So we have to take a sample of prices from what we call the market basket in the case of the CPI. But think of a story an older relative may have told you about how prices are much higher now than they were when that relative was your age. Go ahead and think of one. Maybe they said, when I was your age, movie tickets were only, fill in the blank. I don't know, $2, $1. When I was your age, cars were only this. You fill in the figure. There's plenty of examples I'm sure you can come up with, but assuming that you've heard stories where people are complaining or at least sharing with you how prices are so much higher today. Those are examples of inflation, of course. Now, there's a couple of interesting sites I want you to pause this video and play with. So do these now. There's one here that is an inflation calculator where you can put in figures and see the impact of inflation over the years. So pause the video and do that now, then come back. Alright, hopefully you had some fun with that. And as I've written here, I think it's fun to play with, but scary to think about. Now try the second link down here. This is a future value calculator. Pause the video and do that now. Okay, welcome back. So obviously time plays a big role in finance, and prices fluctuate over time. We all know this. Not necessarily every price fluctuates at the same rate. If you're thinking about an increase in food prices over a period of time, chances are, even though the prices of that food have increased, perhaps significantly, they probably haven't accelerated as much as the price of tuition for college. So we have to have a measure that looks at all prices to try to judge in rough terms what the standard of living is becoming. Because of course, if prices start to accelerate across most items that we buy, that we depend on for our standard of living in the country overall, then we could argue that life isn't as good in a materialistic sense as it has been in the recent past. So we want to judge those kinds of things. Now, when we talk about measurements, whether it has to do with prices or later on employment and unemployment, even GDP, I want to emphasize that these are basic measures. These are not things that are absolute ways, of course, of measuring the quality of life. There are things that can't be measured. The value of your leisure time, your relationships. And so sometimes we can be a little bit overly simplistic in economics and almost equate these kinds of things, calculating the CPI, calculating the unemployment rate with our degree of national happiness. But that's not necessarily the case. And the calculations themselves are imperfect. There are weaknesses that most people recognize that are familiar with how to do these calculations. So keep that in mind too. They're not perfect measures of happiness, certainly, and just within themselves there are some weaknesses in terms of whether they're judging prices, whether they're judging unemployment and the employment picture. They have weaknesses and faults within the measurements themselves. But let's talk about the one that's used most frequently, CPI. The CPI, which stands for the Consumer Price Index, is a weighted average of the prices of all goods and services. And one of the things you need to know for this class is how to actually compute the CPI. Now, in reality, when the government calculates the CPI, they pull on a lot more information that you would have to do for a test for me or for the AP exam. What you're going to get is a simplified scenario where you're given maybe just a few items that we say are part of the typical consumer's market basket in a given country. It's frankly very unrealistic. But let's go ahead and look at one example. Let's say you were given these numbers. You were given an example for the current year of what is in the market basket for the average person in a given country. Let's say this is the United States, and according to information that you're given, the average person has in their market basket, through the course of the year, they purchase 10 pens, 5 shirts, 3 pairs of shoes. Now, we want to try to compare years, and in this illustration, you've got the current year, but also a base year or a former year off to the right side. So this is where we are right now. This was the market basket in a previous year. We can arbitrarily name a base year, which ultimately, typically, if you're going to compare year to year, has an arbitrary number of 100. We'll get to that in just a second. But what you want to do is take each of these items, 10 pens for instance, and multiply them by the price that was charged that year. If it's the current year in this case, 10 pens at 70 cents each would give you $7. That's the expenditure on pens for the year. 5 shirts times the price of $14 per shirt gives you $70 spent in the average person's market basket on shirts for the year. 3 pairs of shoes, 30 bucks each, is a total of 90. So in the average market basket, and I don't know where they're getting their food, because I'm not going to be able to live on pens, shirts, and shoes, by the way. This is supposed to be a broad measure of prices, but once again, it's unrealistic. The average person in this country would spend $167 on their market basket. Now in a previous year, which usually due to experience we know is a year that's going to have lower prices, in this case we see that as a matter of fact, you would have to do the same thing and then compare the 2 years. So in a previous year, in this example the base year, pens only cost 20 cents. Previously we saw that in the current year it's 70 cents. $7 and $10 are the other prices from this previous year. So you add up what was spent on the average person's market basket in the previous year, it's $67. And so to compute the CPI, you take the total dollar expenditure on the market basket in the current year, divide it by the previous year or the base year, times 100, and now you get a figure. In this case, the figure is $2.49. So if you're given a similar situation, that's how you calculate the CPI. As I said before, especially if we're going to compare years to each other or take a look at how prices have changed over time, typically what economists do is they say, well, we're going to judge a base year, a starting point, which is kind of just our home base for simplicity's sake. And the base year for the United States, I think, is 1983 or 82. That's where we said that's going to be a CPI of 100, and then all other CPIs will be pegged off of that. Now, once we have the CPI for various years, we can compute a percentage change in prices and see how fast prices have been changing, usually rising, but not always rising. Let's take a look at the CPI over the years in real sense, right here. Go ahead and pause the video. Make sure when you're looking at this, you scroll down on the page to take a look at historical figures and actual CPIs that have been calculated over the years, and then come back. Okay, welcome back. So, how could we use information like the figures that you've seen historically to judge how life is changing with regards to prices? Well, there's a very simple calculation that we would do, one of which at least, that judges the percentage change from one year to another, or perhaps over a range of years, which is the same calculation you use to judge a percentage increase or decrease in anything. The formula is here. You would do the CPI of the later year minus the CPI of the earlier year, divided by the CPI of the earlier year, times 100. And if you stop and think about that, it's the same formula you've used in basic math classes to figure out a percentage change in some other situation. Let's say we're talking about, the number of touchdowns you scored in one year compared to the previous year. And more specifically, what the percentage increase or decrease would be. Let's say you scored 10 touchdowns in year 1, which was last year. Year 2, this year you scored 15 touchdowns. And you go, great, I scored 5 more touchdowns. That's certainly an improvement. That's an increase in production. But I wonder what the percentage increase is. You would do 15 minus 10 over 10 times 100. The new number minus the old number divided by the old number times 100. And it's the same thing when you're calculating a percentage increase or decrease for the CPI. Of course, if there's an increase over a period of time, that's what we call inflation. This begs the next question then. If there is inflation, which is pretty typical, are you beating inflation, or is inflation beating you? In other words, since you get the fact, I hope, that your dollars aren't worth the same amount every single year. $10 can't buy today what it could 50 years ago. Are you keeping pace with inflation, or are you not? We'll talk about me for a minute. Along with all the other teachers at Chaminade, and this is not just particular to Chaminade, in a lot of different professions this is the case, they give us regular pay increases to help us keep pace with inflation. Some places actually peg it to inflation. So let's say that prices, or the CPI in particular, was published, as it frequently is. You just saw one source of that. And it's published, when it's published, it says that there were 2% increase in prices. You might have an employer that says, we will give you a 2% increase in your pay so that you keep pace with inflation. We know that from a fairness standpoint, if we kept how much you made constant for 3 or 4 years, as prices are going up around you and all the stuff that you have to buy to live your lifestyle becomes more expensive, you're able to afford less gradually. So we're going to give you a pay increase that's indexed to inflation. That's not always the case, though. People's incomes change at the same time that prices are changing, and so you can actually do some calculations, you're required to for this class, that could judge whether you or someone else is keeping pace with inflation. How do you do this? Well, you take your nominal income, and nominal just means a number, pure and simple. The current dollar amount that we're talking about, let's say this year you made $60,000, and you convert it to real income. Real income adjusts for these price changes. It takes them out and says, all right, now we can compare apples to apples. So a very simple calculation allows us to do that, to convert nominal to real income. You take your nominal income, divide it by the CPI for that year, and multiply times 100. So if you want to see some actual examples of calculations, these are in your book, starting on page 119. 3 different cases. One, keeping up with inflation. Another case where the person is not keeping up with inflation, and then beating inflation, outpacing inflation. You need to be able to do all of those calculations. You need to memorize the formulas and be able to use them in certain situations. Another kind of calculation you need to be able to do is to convert or compare dollars from one year to another. This is a little bit different. Think of this like having money that you're going to put in a time machine and see what it could really buy in a different year. Because as we said before, those dollars aren't worth the same year in and year out. Your purchasing power, as we call it, changes. Your purchasing power today with $10, for instance, is much less than it was 50 years ago. So how do you do this? Well, as it says here, to calculate the real income for a destination year, if you want to think about it like that, think of your time machine as taking you to a destination year. You would take the income that you want to be converted and multiply it by the CPI of the destination year divided by the CPI of the year the money was earned. So for example, my dad and I were born 25 years apart, went to the same high school. I followed to some degree in his footsteps. So let's say we were going to do a comparison. Let's say we were even competitive and we were going, all right, I did better than you when I was your age. No, you didn't. Well, let's convert apples to apples and compare. Let's say my dad's income in 1980 was $24,000 a year. I clearly remember when I was in middle school having them talk to us about potential careers and saying, you know, here's a list of jobs that you might want to really think about preparing yourself for, kind of guiding your academic career into those paths, because these are all jobs that pay really well. These are all jobs that pay $20,000 and above. Well, obviously, the game has changed. The field has moved. And it's difficult to make ends meet, to say the least, on $20,000 a year today. But let's do a conversion, because of course back then, as you can imagine, $20,000 went a lot further. So let's say my dad's income in 1980 was $24,000 a year. My income 25 years later, in 2005, was $55,000. Who made more real income at that stage of life when we were both 35 years old? Well, the CPI is in your textbook, and so I'm going to use, for this example, the actual figures published in your textbook. Let's put Dad's money in a time machine first. Dad's real income at 25 in 2005 dollars, so take the 24 grand he made in 1980 and let's put it in the time machine, would be calculated as doing 24 grand times the CPI in 2005 divided by the CPI in 1980. And you do those calculations, you convert that 24,000 to $56,883. So you say, well, gosh, Mr. Giddy, you made 55 grand, not bad in 2005, but your dad beat you. He beat you by a little bit more, $1,883. Of course, we could have put my money in the time machine, my money from 2005, my 55 grand, and transported it back to 1980, and that calculation is shown here. Notice that the ratio is flipped, so it's 55 grand times the CPI in 1980, now in 1980 is in the numerator, divided by the CPI in 2005, and ultimately you get a figure of 23,205, and of course I still lose. He edged me out there too. So this is how you can compare and convert dollars from one year to the next. It's kind of a fun thing to do. Not a bad idea if you want to talk to a parent or a relative and do some conversions on your own. Now, the CPI is not the only way that we measure prices. Another one is called the PPI, or the Producer Price Index. Okay, so we've been talking about looking at it from a consumer or a buyer's perspective. You can also look at it from an entrepreneur, a seller, a producer's perspective. You don't have to know how to do that calculation, but you do need to know what the PPI is. The GDP implicit price deflator does have a calculation that I need you to know, but there's going to be a PowerPoint coming up that you're going to click on from the notes that talks about that, and I'll let that serve as the way to discuss it with you. But that's based on all goods and services produced in an economy. It's not just a sampling, a market basket, as is the case with the CPI. So here's all three of them charted over a period of time, starting back around 1930 and going to almost where we are today, looking at the percentage change over the years of the PPI, the CPI, and the GDP deflator. Next time we're going to talk about employment.